to welcome our guests, Kirsten and Chris, to present to you from their expertise on crisis communications management. I hope that this is going to be very beneficial to you and that you're going to participate actively. Please take advantage of this great opportunity to have these experts with us today to ask questions and be really as involved as you can be. Use the chat if you'd like, or you can always ask questions as well, turning on your camera and your microphone. I'm going to pass, I don't know who's starting, Chris or Kirsten? Kirsten? I'll pass the mic over to Kirsten. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you so much. I'm actually just going to share my, can someone make me a host?
Yes.
Apologies for sharing. Excellent, thank you. Whilst we're doing that, I just wanted to share, my name is Kirsten Walcom. I'm an executive vice president for a firm called Smith & Company here based in London. And also on the line, we have my colleague, Chris. Chris, just wanted to share my screen. Oh, can you all see that?
Yes.
Perfect, okay, great. And now just to be, do you see it in presenter view or just in normal PowerPoint?
Presenter view.
Okay, so you see what I'm seeing. All right, everyone, this is a first example of tech, how we're gonna do it together here. Oh, come on now, world. 1 second, apologies. You would think. Oh my God. Sorry, 1 second, guys. Here we go. Excellent. Excellent, thank you. Are you able to see it now?
Yes, got it.
Perfect. All right, thank you all very much. So as I was saying, very inarticulately, my name is Kirsten Walcom. I'm the executive vice president for a firm called Smith & Company based in London. What we're going to do today is really talk to you about crisis management. I am joined by my colleague Chris, who has joined us from DC this morning, and I'm going to pass it over to him in a moment. But what we really want to do is talk to you about crisis communications in specifically an international organization mindset. So we understand as an organization that is kind of federated business model or a membership based national offices as well as international offices as well as regional offices, your circumstance and experiences are different than say how a multinational corporate may feel with one kind of same architecture, one board, etc. So what we've been doing is working really closely with David and his team around how we could do some better crisis preparedness in an international organization mindset and how we could all work together on improving this piece of work, as well as it is just kind of a common thing that does need to happen with big clients and companies. So please don't feel that this is something that is targeted towards Scouts in any way. Actually, it's something that we are seeing and we work with a lot of international organizations to do so. So I'm going to pass over to Chris to kind of walk you through and give you some sense of who we are. And then we really do want this session to be really informal. It's actually how we work best. We also do this a lot with different clients around the world and find it is the most effective way if we can be really kind of open and direct and just really jump in with any questions. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Chris.
Sure, thanks, Kirsten. Just to give you a quick recap, as Kirsten said, we're a strategic advisory firm. So crisis and issue management really is what all the members of our firm do day to day. And so this is, as you all are well aware, this is a new landscape which we all find ourselves in, which is increasingly digitally driven. There used to be a concept of a news cycle. It's more of a perpetual cycle now. So what we really try to do with these trainings is give you some kind of core fundamental principles that work in the field so that you're best prepared both to mitigate crises, and when they do happen and you have hiccups or bumps in the road, you're able to manage those most effectively. I think what we find in the macro sense is global organizations are often caught on the back foot when it comes to brand protection. And so doing these processes of training, repetitiveness just builds that muscle memory for your organization, and you get a sense of how to flow through these events. Because as you are aware, there's no organization that is immune from crises these days. It's pretty much a constant in our world. So that's kind of where we come from in terms of worldview. Like I said, crisis is a constant. It's the new normal. We fundamentally believe, protecting your assets as an organization is one of the most important things you can do collectively. And it really requires you and all the members of your team to have a real sense of core principles and how to adjust course in real time. Because if you don't, you will just get very damaged in terms of brand and reputation. And it can really affect your ability as an organization to do the important work and further the important programs that you do at Scouts. So that's big picture what we do and kind of how we view the world. Like I said, we're going to walk you through this deck. Please feel free to ask questions of us and stop us at any time so that we can give guidance or give any sort of feedback that you have and give us your sense of how things are from where you sit. That's how we give these presentations, and we found those are the most effective ways to do it. That's a little bit of background of our experience. As we've said, it runs the gamut between international organizations, corporate America. So we get to see it as a group, our team, from every vantage point you possibly could around the globe. And I think that really helps us inform these presentations and give you the best advice and counsel on how to manage crises and issues.
Excellent, great. Thank you so much, Chris. So what we want to do today is actually start with the idea of what is a crisis and why does it matter? I think this is a common question. Kind of years and years ago, and I'm definitely aging myself, I'm Canadian and I worked at an agency and we were working on Kraft peanut butter, which if you are North American, that is something that you will know very, very well. We changed the logo of the beloved Kraft peanut butter bear. And this ended up with Canadians calling into the office with everything ranging from hours of tears of people being so upset about their beloved bear being gone to people actually providing threatening messages. And I remember at the outset thinking, is this a crisis? And it was pretty junior. I was pretty early on in my career. And since then have seen in different ways in different sectors, what is a crisis? How does it affect your business? And what are the longer term impacts? As Chris mentioned, we really are seeing a more of a constant crisis normal. And what that means is the way that we are looking at crises, the way the audience is looking at organizations and what they expect from us as a whole has changed and has shifted. So a crisis itself really can be anything from reputational. It can be from, we're going to look at some specific ones that are kind of more common within the Scouts movement themselves, but it might be a reputational crisis. It might have longer term impacts. It might be something urgent like a safeguarding or a safe from harm or any kind of violence, misconduct. There's a wide range of what could be a crisis, but what we do know is that they increasingly have a relevance and an effect on your brand. So a crisis has a real impact on brand health. This could be on favorability. It could be on how your brand is perceived. It could be on actually, you may see a dip in someone being willing to buy your peanut butter, for instance. So depending on how you handle a crisis, it has a real impact on the health of the organization and the brand. Credibility is an interesting point here because increasingly in this near crisis climate or constant crisis climate, whether an organization is credible also really dictates whether they're seen as favorable, whether they're trusted, and whether they are trusted and whether they are seen as credible and have a position within their area of expertise really dictates on whether someone is going to support you, whether someone is going to stay loyal to you, and actually whether what you are saying is going to be taken seriously. So often when you see an organization has lost in credibility, you may experience this as a company who comes out and promises again and again and again that they're going to fix a problem. But because they're not seen as credible in this topic or as in this area, those promises and commitments are actually not believed. So whether you are seen as credible has a real impact on your brand health and your ability to navigate through a crisis. When we look at support and why crisis matters in support for organizations like Scouts, this really can look at, it could be financial support, so donations, it can be membership, so people actually willing to participate in the Scouting movement, and it also can be allies, so those who are willing to speak up and speak out in support of Scouts if something were to go wrong or in the middle of a crisis. And lastly is long-term. So what we are now seeing is that with this bubble of trust and credibility, the more trusted and credible you're seen, the less you're hit by a crisis, right? By nature, people are more willing to kind of give you the benefit of the doubt. But if there's already a dip, then it's harder to build back from that. So when we say long term, and apologies if that seems convoluted, but when we say long term in a crisis means the audience remembers everything. And we have to assume that if something has happened over here, that it will have an impact on the other side. And what I mean by that is it doesn't go away so easily. With a 24/7 news cycle, with the internet, it's very easy to Google what has happened. And on the front page, you may see all of the stories that you don't want to hear, and therefore it has a longer term effect. Any questions about kind of why a crisis matters, or from your own perspective? Excellent. So we were working with David and we spoke through, and actually, I should mention, I'm also the former Global Communications Director for Save the Children International. And why I say that is it does give, Chris and I worked very closely actually while I was at Save, as Smith and Company helped us on a lot of really important and key moments, everything from global crises to safety and security issues to financial mismanagement, to operational wrongdoing, physical. The list here is something that I understand very acutely, and that we've all worked on together. We've put these in here because these are the ones that you are most likely to experience in your day-to-day role as communicators within the world. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, within Scouts. I keep wanting to say the World Scouting Movement, but I'm just going to say Scouts. I'm getting my mouth around it. Apologies, everyone. But these are really common. And unfortunately, we are seeing these types of stories and crises pop up, whether it is through social or in general, more and more. Why this is a bit, actually, I'll come back here on why that is a little bit. So we're going to talk about it further on, but I want to kind of drive up the idea here. Is we used to work within international affairs and international organizations, we used to benefit from our purpose being inherently good, right? So we were working under the concept of trying to do better for the world. And as such, we were given an inherent level of trust from our audiences, whether that was from regulators, whether it was from the general public, whether it was from your mom, right? There was a kind of an idea that you do good in your work and therefore you can be trusted. Increasingly, there is a number of there's a significant amount of increased interest around the misconduct and mismanagement of international affairs organizations. It stems from the corporate sector that then came to the aid sector, and I think and then it has now gone into international organizations. It was always going to happen, but we are feeling it and starting to see it much more acutely. And these are the things that they look for in the first instance. So when we talk about trends of crisis, and Chris, please feel free to jump in here on these, because I know they're ones that we deal with our corporate clients all the time. But kind of big things that are happening in the wider crisis world are the speed of the news cycle, right? So everything is faster now. It used to be, and again, I'm aging myself, but when I started working in PR, you pitched, you then sometimes even faxed in a pitch, and you waited for it to come back, but you had the benefit if something went wrong of the next day's news cycle. So if you didn't get into the headlines by 10 p.m. or whenever the papers were going out, you had a bit of a breathing room. That's not the case anymore. There's a 24/7 news cycle, which also means for international organizations, if something happened in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, it's going to get to Malaysia by the 10 in the morning, the next day, right? So it's that constant speed and and the internet has made for it to be impossible to have any regional boundaries. So we know that with the speed of the news cycle and with the different audiences and interest in international stories, it gets picked up a lot faster. With the rise of fake news, I think this is one that doesn't need a whole lot of introduction or discussion. I'm sure it's something you're all very, very familiar with. We are increasingly seeing a number of stories that are coming up to discredit or influence individuals to think one way, rightly or wrongly. I don't know if you all saw, there was an interview this week at Davos with Bill Gates, And he spoke out about the fact that he was deeply surprised that he and Dr. Fauci, who is the chief medical officer of the US, that he was deeply surprised that the two of them were so regularly mentioned associated with conspiracy theories. And he then went on to say that he didn't understand which kind of people would believe these theories. And that in and of itself is a problem of the fake news culture. Because not only is there a rise of fake news that's happening that talks about vaccines aren't good, this is unhealthy, all of these stories that are spiraling and causing huge concern, but then it also gives a rise of concerns around whether there is two different sides of the story and and it makes it hard for us to move the movable middle, which takes us to identity politics. And Chris, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. And these are all key trends. As you know, globally around the world, you're seeing a rise in identity politics. You're seeing a rise in splinter groups having more influence than they did historically across the globe. So that is another trend line that is it's just a factor of so many issues that now are traveling at the speed of the internet. There's a growing sense by the media and other stakeholders of accountability and transparency as well. That is, essential to any organization, but now you're just under increasing pressure to deal with these issues from all sorts of stakeholder groups that are going to take an interest in what scouting does, and how you are reporting different things are just going to be more highly scrutinized by a wider variety of groups than ever before. We have on here another example of cancel culture. You can look at the Me Too movement. You can look at the, as Kirsten mentioned, the response to the pandemic and different groups taking positions on vaccines currently. All of these issues are the context in which you as an organization have to operate. So it's important for you when you're thinking about crisis to think about how you're going to manage through that and realize all of these trend lines that we've kind of identified, and there's many others, and there's going to be many more kind of local issues in the public affairs realm that are going to be ongoing. You have to factor that into your operations, and you have to be attuned to those trend lines so that you know that when you're communicating in that environment, how things are going to play with different audiences and different stakeholders. All that has to be taken into account. Trying to change slides, bear with me. And the next, I'm sorry.
No. So sorry, I'm having difficulty with my internet. Apologies. It's just popping off and on. Apologies. So I'm just going to be off video just for a second. So what we want to talk about here really, really quickly is just the idea of that change of international affairs organizations and how the scrutiny has really kind of become more of a focus. So this is actually a story of something I worked on and Chris worked on years ago. So this is an image from Turkey and the shores of Greece. And it was during the refugee crisis of 2015. And this was a Save the Children response. We really thought that our response to search and rescue, to responding in the Mediterranean to this massive movement of people would be met with at least neutral headlines like the ones you're seeing. So the ideas we thought was we were a humanitarian organization. We needed to save lives, and that is what we did. We thought that we were starting a search and rescue operation, so a boat that actually operated between Libya and Italy in the channel, and we thought that it would be met with an understanding of what our aims and purpose was trying to do. But unfortunately, we actually were met with headlines like this. So these are not all Save the Children headlines. As you can see, Oxfam was in here, but this all started to happen around the same time. The international affairs sector, whether you are a charity, whether you're an international organization, are being hit more regularly with scrutiny and with challenges to credibility in a way that really that implicates and changes the way we are perceived, and therefore how trusted we are when any crisis happens because we're being framed in this way. One of the things that we wanted to talk to you about in theory, and again, this will be shared with you after, it's not important that you desperately understand it, but it's really important that we think about it in our messaging strategy. Specifically, it's called the perception gap. So often certain organizations like international affairs organizations often see, again, because they are inherently good, because they are inherently trusted, that they believe their trust levels are this purple line up top. It's how trusted we think we are, right? We know that our purpose is to do good for the people that we work with. It could be to change the world through scouting. It could be to work on the beaches in Greece. But we very rarely actually measure if we are that trusted. And anything in between is what is called the perception gap. So if there is a big perception gap between your organization and how trusted you think you are, and actually how trusted you are by the public, that perception gap impacts how your messages will be received by the public. Because again, if you're messaging like you think they all feel that they really, really trust you up here, and actually how they're feeling about you is way down here from the trust level, then actually it won't resonate. So that's the concept of the perception gap. So any questions there before we move on? Great, thank you.
So next we're going to talk about crisis response. And this is a framework that you can work from to start to begin to think about how will we manage crisis and how will we respond. So the first phase is what we've identified is identify and assess. During that phase, you want to be thinking about, this is before you've had an issue. You want to start landscape mapping. And part of that is what we outlined earlier, which is start to think about the environment and the issues that are at play externally to the organization at any given moment. It's also important to do a risk or a vulnerability assessment, thinking through what issues and what potential problems are there within the organization and what can you be doing now to mitigate those issues. And as part of that, you want to identify your levels of risk and prioritize what you feel are the more top tier issues and deal with those first, and then work your way down that list. As part of that, you want to look at stakeholder and influencer mapping and identifying those folks that could possibly be detractors and also allies, so that you have all that at the ready when you need it. We also recommend monitoring and heat mapping just so that you have a sense and an ongoing basis with regularity of all the potential issues that are out there, all the potential issues that could impact the organization. You're routinely monitoring that so that you are never kind of caught off guard at any given moment. Next, we bring you to preparation. That's where you start to actually develop a crisis plan, figure out how you want to respond to different issues, and socialize that internally within your organizations. Part of that can also be running crisis simulation. So you kind of put your teams through the paces and figure out, how would you actually respond if an issue were to happen? That can include, 3 scenarios, 4 scenarios, how many you see fit, but it's always good, we found, to kind of stress test things in real time with your organization so that you kind of build that rapport with your colleagues and you're able to respond much more effectively when the real thing happens. Message content, creative development, that's another good thing to already have in your pocket in the heat of the moment in a crisis. There'll be a lot of scrambling and there'll be a lot of moving parts, so to speak. So if you can start creating those frameworks in terms of messaging, communications tools, creative executions as well, it just makes that response time that much faster and you able to kind of maneuver through in a much more rapid way. Crisis media training, that just means making sure that the folks that you're going to have as front-facing, public-facing spokespeople, they're prepared and they understand what that's like. If they're going to be interviewed by the media, if they're going to come into contact with any sort of regulatory body, if they're going to be out making speeches just to the general public or to other scouting organizations, it's just good to practice that so that they're able to deliver your core messaging in the most effective way possible. The engagement phase, that covers kind of all of the ways that you can proactively message outward. And as everyone knows now, digital communications has to be part of that. There's opportunities both in the digital and the traditional media space for some paid advertising. It may make sense to do that depending on what the issue is and what the messaging is you're trying to get out to various stakeholders, thought leadership. And again, you want to always be real-time monitoring and measuring. Lastly, once you're kind of to the other side of that trend, of that crisis piece or managing an issue, you want to start thinking about how do you mitigate and recover your reputation. And so you really need to be thinking like, what are we going to do moving forward if there was an issue to operationally change whatever needs to be changed, and how are you going to communicate those changes to the public, right? Because the name of the game now is not only just to manage the crisis at the moment, you've really got to communicate to all your stakeholders, what did you do to deal with that moving forward, and what operational changes have you made as an organization that are going to make sure that that sort of issue does not become problematic again. A lot of organizations get through that first part, and then there's no follow-up on the latter. And that will cause you problems, because as we said in the presentation earlier, there's so many more stakeholders now that are going to scrutinize and look at what you're saying, what you've done as an organization, that you will be held accountable at some point for doing what you say you're going to do. So we always advise clients, it's better to make the changes, even though sometimes these issues, and I wouldn't even say sometimes, most times, these require some very hard choices and hard decisions to be made, but it's better to make them in the short term so that you can move forward rather than have an issue just drag on and be prolonged, causing damage to the organization over time. I think we're talking a little bit about preparation, identify and assess. So how do you actually go about assessing a situation? For us, it's all about asking the right questions. You want to start thinking about what level and category of crisis is this? And how could this escalate? Is this the sort of, for example, if there's a financial issue, is this the sort of issue that's going to affect one office? Is this something that is more of a systemic issue that is going to raise itself up across offices? You need to start scaling and deciding what is the potential for escalation for any issue. Where is the crisis centrally located? Who are the key stakeholders internally or externally that are going to be affected? What's the timeline on when this happened? When did we know and what did we do about it at the time? What actions have we taken to intervene? Or did we not take any actions? Has this happened before? What's kind of the historic trend line of this issue? Any other relevant information in that context is going to be important, because again, communicating in a transparent manner is one of the key principles of managing through a crisis. And it can be painful and it can be hard to gather all the information, and you're not going to know all the information at once. So it's going to require a lot of work by internally to gather all that information, but it behooves you to do so. Are there other partners and stakeholders that are affected? Because you're going to want to communicate to them, because they're going to be reading or hearing about these issues as well. And they want to hear from you directly on what's being done about the situation. Is there media interest? That goes without saying. That requires a different level of communications, and that requires some very, I think, thoughtful strategic planning in terms of when and how you respond to the media. And is this a situation that's going to require legal counsel as well? That's another factor to always consider. If there's any litigation risk, that obviously sends the crisis to another level of management. So those are all things to think about in terms of preparation.
And don't be worried about kind of writing these down. These are all going to be shared with you in a template. So you will have these as almost like a checklist of questions to think about. The one thing I would just build on what Chris has said here is when thinking and going through, often the comms people might be the first people who are starting to answer these questions. And it can be really tempting to try to answer them really quickly and not to dig in to the things that might identify patterns. So has this happened before? Or what other relevant parties might need to know about this information and or might be invested or could just be involved full stop. Often experience has taught us that sometimes it's almost like unpeeling an onion, where you have to kind of, maybe the first answer isn't the right answer, that you need to kind of keep probing at it. So we share that more of just as you are doing this more and more, do strive for greatest transparency and in-depth answering as you possibly can, because for communicators and for anyone managing a crisis, the more information you have up front, the better prepared you are to manage and deal with the crisis moving forward.
Let's talk a little bit about the crisis team. This will be your core unit that's going to be charged with managing the crisis. And this is very important in terms of how you're kind of going to manage the situation and determining how big of a group that will be, how small a group that will be. You really need to outline that before a crisis hits so that those team members are accustomed to working together and they each know their roles and responsibilities. That can include, for example, these are all, and this will change given the situation, and these are all kind of the potential ways of looking at this. Do you need a technical expert? Is there going to be someone that was on the ground from events? What about finance, CFO, accounting firm? Does that need to be pulled into this? Obviously, comms and media, we're biased, definitely needs to be as part of that unit. There'll be times where you'll need certain members of the board. You maybe need a regional or country level person as well involved. Someone from the Safe from Harm team. Depending on the scenario, you're going to have to expand or contract your crisis team, but these are kind of like the big buckets. You should always have that unit functioning and running and knowing that their roles and responsibilities are going to be called into play to manage the situation. Kirsten, am I leaving anything out on that piece?
No, thank you. I think just the only builds I would say there is also one of the challenges in an international organization is you might need to pull in, as Chris said, different parties from different NSOs, different regional offices, country offices, etc. So my experience has been that often a CMT or a crisis response team can seem really cool from the outside. Honestly, when all of us, as we know, those who are in it, being in that room every day doesn't always feel that way, but you often get a lot of voices who want to be inside the crisis response team. Size matters. The more voices you have in that room, the more convoluted the messaging, the decision-making, the timeliness can take place. So think of roles and responsibilities. Does everyone around the table have a role? Do they have a responsibility? Do they clearly understand it? Do they know what you need from them and how you expect them to do it? So make sure that there's no kind of just outliers who are there just because they think it's fun. And I hear how horrible that sounds, but it's that kind of concept. Also, I think when there are so many different competing groups in a room, unless you naturally have a CEO or someone from a hierarchical structure who is immediately the decision maker, it can be hard to decide who takes the final decision. So this is something that you should think about at the outset, who is ultimately the decision maker. I've been in a few crisis response teams where we've had to do it co and joint. So maybe it was someone from the international office as well as someone from the national office, and they had a co-responsibility for that ultimate decision making, but that worked better than us trying to do it by committee. So those are the only other pieces. Any questions?
Let's talk a little bit about setting up the team itself. So look, the crisis response team, is convened and needs to convene with some regularity and depending on the situation. Sometimes that could be once a day, that could be once a week, that could be multiple times a day, given in the morning, once in the morning, once in the evening. Just really depends on the severity of the situation. That team will also be charged with determining the level and category of the crisis, whether it's national, regional, or global. They need to be charged with developing the action plan, some of the key steps that we outlined earlier in the presentation. That would be the core team that builds that crisis response plan and gives everyone in the organization their assignments and kind of the timeline and how the issue will be managed. They'll also be responsible for constantly implementing, like I said, and monitoring the situation. And one of the key things that, I think these are always kind of good core principles, but fundamentally a crisis is dynamic. And so the reason why you see us trying to apply so much discipline to the process is because it's going to be a dynamic situation no matter what the issue is. And there's going to be a lot of competing interest, a lot of competing information. There's going to be a lot of information that's going to change over the course of it. And so if you build these kind of strong core group now, it makes it easier to manage the flow. If everyone's kind of running around in different directions, it just makes managing the issue much more difficult in an inherently difficult situation. So we really recommend putting this crisis team together early for your planning purposes walking them through different simulations, getting the team ready to move on a dime. It really does help when the real thing comes along to have a core group that understands each other, knows each other, has worked with each other in some capacity in the past. You'll find that extremely helpful, I think, in a real-time environment.
Excellent. So we want to take you through, and again, we will be sharing all of this with you in a template and document, a suite of materials that are being developed by the Bureau. But we want to kind of walk through what the different levels of a crisis could look like. And we've worked closely with David and Farah to help build out the kind of our green, amber, red that you're about to see. So please also do feel free to jump in, David, Farah, or anyone else, if you'd like to talk through. But one of the things we think of when we think of as a green or a low level crisis is something that has minimal reputational risk. Maybe one or a very small number of NSOs are aware of the issue. This is the first time it has been identified, and it's not an issue that keeps popping up around the movement. As Chris has mentioned, we've mentioned a few times actually, landscape mapping. So it is you'll hear us keep talking about patterns and landscapes and trends. This is really important because the media love a pattern. So if they see the similar issue happening, we all may see it as, well, no, it's never happened in my office before. But if it's also happened in the UK and Colombia and El Salvador and Kenya, wherever it may be, that to the media is a pattern of behavior. So again, if it's the first time, that's one thing, but if it's been identified elsewhere, something we need to think about. If it's not a key issue in the media or externally, so we know we've kind of looked at the really unpleasant headlines that we've all unfortunately are aware of and had to deal with. There are certain topics that do kind of always reach interest right now with the media, right? So it could be anything from sexual harassment to bullying to there's a financial mismanagement. There's a great number of governance of topics that would be considered hot topics by the media. So if that is one, that would ramp up the topic. It's not a key issue internally that could lead to external issues. So again, an internal issue around HR, for instance, it's really national focus. So we really do think even with the 24-hour news cycle that it's going to stay in one market. And it's likely only a reactive only response. We will talk about proactive versus reactive in just a moment, but this means you probably don't need to do anything immediately or to activate a crisis team. Then we get to amber or yellow. So this would be kind of a moderate reputational risk or a moderate risk in general. There may be more than 2, 3, so NSOs are somewhat aware of the crisis. The issue has been flagged and or happened in other markets. So you do know there it is kind of popping up in a few places. It's related to a hot topic. It is a sensitive topic. So again, financial mismanagement, safe from harm issues. It's likely to gain media interest because of that. There already may be some bubbling social media interest. You may be seeing that, okay, there's the conversation online is asking about more than one market, or it just may have implications on more than one market. It could be therefore regional. It would be appropriate to set up a regular crisis response team if these are the cases, and it's likely to end up being a hybrid of a reactive and proactive response. And finally, high. This is your highest risk level within the Scout movement. So it's something that is very severe, that it will have an impact on the majority of NSOs and the wider organization as a whole. It is already or inevitably going to be gaining significant media engagement or online conversation. This could be, for instance, an internal only issue at the moment. So basically what I mean by that is only you guys know about it, right? All of your different offices, it has not been leaked to the public. There's no external conversation around it, but it's the type of issue you know that if it went into the public discourse, it's a really hot topic. So that would be great. That would be a red. Often those are around regulatory, funding, safeguarding, operational implications. So for instance, if a scouting office in the Middle East has lost its license or right to actually operate there, that could be an issue that has a wider implication for many. This is usually a global crisis. So something that again does span multiple markets, whether it only is staying within the confines of one market now, it's how it could be perceived globally. So thinking not necessarily about the here and now, but actually the implications potential of it. At this point, you probably need daily crisis response team meetings And again, you'll all be there knowing your roles and responsibilities in that room together. And it's very likely to be a hybrid of reactive and proactive response, meaning we may be looking at some allies or sympathetic journalists that we go to out proactively with our story to try to shape that narrative. And we may then take an inbound requests from those who are a bit more hostile. So that's something we'll talk about in a second. Any question on the kind of red, amber, green? Great. So one thing I wanted to talk about here is, again, going into the conversation, and we've talked about it a few times, and I know I keep talking about it, but landscape mapping and pattern mapping. So here's an example of UN peacekeepers. This is something I'm sure that you're all very familiar with or aware. These are all snippets of different headlines of stories around the world. And what has happened consistently with the peacekeepers is a pattern, right? The UN has, unfortunately, the media has disclosed and found that there has been a pattern of misbehavior and misconduct and abuse in many of the countries where peacekeepers have been deployed. In some of the countries where they've been deployed to be the ones who actually help and protect the individuals. This pattern of abuse is now what's being disclosed as significant mismanagement by the UN. There's been numerous media accounts on it. There's been deep investigations. There's been audits at the highest level. But the thing is, it keeps happening, right? And the reason why I really want to point it out of pattern mapping is the way that the UN looked at this initially is these issues were isolated in all the different countries. Bad eggs, bad apples, different countries. But it actually took one media investigation to say, nope, there's something wrong here, right? And literally they pattern mapped. And that is actually how it became to be the story that it has been, which is great. You've put a public eye on a really huge issue that needs to be dealt with. But what we're trying to say in this experience is, had the issues that had been investigated in South Sudan been reported through one global organization, the issues in CAR might have been dealt with faster. Then the issues in the Central African Republic actually weren't looked at. And then when peacekeepers went into the Philippines after Haiyan, it all started to happen again. And then at that point, we're spanning continents, time zones, everything. The pattern was there, and it's made for a huge trust and credibility gap for the peacekeepers. This is going to lead us into talking about landscape mapping and stakeholder mapping. So when you're in a crisis, it's really important to know who your stakeholders are and what you want them to do. So it can be really, a crisis is often chaotic, right? There are a few of us who love it and thrive in a crisis, and many of us just end up getting stuck in it, right? So, and that's okay, but it's really important that when you're in a crisis, you know who you want to reach and what you want them to know, feel, and do. What I mean by this is, if we know that we have to talk to, so say you're dealing with, this is a very sensitive issue, but something like what peacekeepers are dealing with, there's a range of stakeholders who they are accountable and responsible to. Everything from the national governments of the countries of where they're operating, straight forward to the staff globally who work for the UN. So what needed to happen is, when you have a crisis you've identified, you need to understand who needs to be informed, what do you need them to feel, and what do you need them to do. So again, I keep reiterating that point because it's really important when we get to an engagement grid of activities that how we want them to respond really hinges on us knowing who they are and those three questions. Before I do influence mapping, any questions on stakeholder mapping? Would it be helpful to talk through more potential stakeholders?
I just want to flag, there is a question in the chat from Susanna. I don't know if you want to get to it later or now, but just to let you.
No, please, it's great. I was tired of hearing me talk, so it's good.
So Susanna works in our regional office for Inter-America, and she's asking about the regular issue that they're dealing with, all the good and the bad that happens with the Boy Scouts of America in the United States. It normally impacts countries in the entire region, not just in the United States. It impacts, I guess, the image and reputation of scouting, I would say even worldwide, but especially in North America. And she's asking, how are we able to prepare for those types of potential crises? And Susanna, feel free to jump in if you want to clarify anything.
And what will be, I would add another question, what will be the best response for these other countries that are not part of the United States? It's
Yeah.
it's hard for me to say. Normally we tell them that it's another country, yet they want to give the opinion of what is happening in the United States.
Look, I'll take a first swing at that, Kirsten, and please jump in. I mean, for us, that goes back to, and that's a very good question, because when we talked about external environment and how that affects, everyone. And I think one of our core principles in dealing with an issue like that is, one is making sure that you respond with empathy. And I think that's coming up in some of the next couple of slides, actually, to a situation and that is, that is extremely difficult for a host of right reasons. And I think what needs to be focused on is, one is making sure that you communicate an empathy for the situation, and two, even though you are not directly involved, having a good sense of knowing what the path forward is and what reforms have been put in place to prevent that from never ever happening again. I think those two things, to me, and Kirsten and I, we've talked about this kind of, because we're always looking at, again, the landscape for scouting is how do you communicate that? And I think you're right, Susanna, to mention that, because there's really no way you can't not address that issue, right? And so I think it's very important, again, and another point that we're coming up to in this presentation is the idea of core message points that you want to get across, and empathy is one of those key factors. And we're right here on stakeholder mapping and knowing how people and audiences feel in a very human sense, and not coming across as not understanding the toll that this has caused people. And so for us, we always are stressing with organizations, and this is not just limited to scouting. It's every large organization. It at a certain level starts to lose that human touch, just due to bureaucracy and growth and more people. And so it's very important. What we always try to do is move organizations back to recognizing the core humanity that we all have to express when something terrible has happened. So that's just one thing that I think is very important. And then I think it's also being able to, and making sure that it's cascaded throughout all or the entire organization, what reforms have been put in place to provide for safety moving forward. Because unfortunately, while you can't undo the past, it's very important, and the public is going to rightfully want to know what is being done in the future to protect children. Kirsten, did I leave anything out?
Yeah, no, I think that covers it. The one thing that we would also say, and it's always a challenge, right, in international organizations, is kind of ideally, whenever you are in a crisis, to try to make sure in the stakeholder mapping, if you think about it, who else could be involved? And if it's something that's happening in your market, it's really easy to forget all of the other scouts and offices that are happening around the world, because you are feeling it the most acutely. You're overworked, you're tired, all of those things. But we do increasingly try to encourage that there is regular sharing of potential issues and crises as they're bubbling, so that when it happens, everyone has that time for preparation, and therefore the messaging is more fluid, as Chris says, so that because you have to be in a position that you can respond. And if you want to be able to respond kind of holistically, that idea of forward planning is really, really important in that landscape mapping. Does that help, Susanna?
It does. We're just preparing something, and that was it. Thank you.
No, of course. And as Chris said, we're going to talk about message development in a minute. And again, all this information will be shared for you, and happy to help. So also, when you're doing your stakeholder mapping, you also want to think about the level of influence they hold. So it could be if you're thinking about the media, it could be if you're thinking about a regulator, that they may hold kind of a significant level of influence on other stakeholders. So their opinion really could impact the way you are seen, how credible you are, and actually how the messages land. Also, you might find, so for instance, in the UK, there's a journalist, his name is Ian Burrell. He works for the Daily Mail and quite regularly comments and posts on the pay of charity leadership, or so how much leaders are paid, or how much their overhead rates of running charities are, et cetera, et cetera. So Ian Burrell has a very, what we would say, a very influential voice. So he's has a lot of influence, not bought into what charities do, right? So he would rank very high on our level of influence, but actually low in support for our position and situation. This is a good way to kind of figure out how stakeholders feel about the issue initially, and then therefore you can also start to try to track how, if you've moved that middle at all, if you've moved them along and taken them along for the journey. Also, it helps you to build the right messages. So if you build messages always for people who are super bought into what you do and what you stand for, again, you lose all of those who may be a bit more concerned, or maybe just a bit more suspicious, all of the feelings that come with a crisis. If you're only ever building messaging for those who are completely bought into your mission, you miss this entire group over here. Great. So again, landscape mapping. I really feel like we have talked about this a lot, but again, it does feel like a big and important issue. So ways that you can do this, when you were actually looking at your landscape map, again, emotional, how do people feel about the issue? Authority, how trusted and credible are you on an issue? This one is really interesting if you're talking about geopolitical issues. If you are, I know you guys do span so many regions around the world that do have different opinions. For instance, we have clients who might work in some countries where LGBTQ rights aren't adhered to or aren't legal, and then we in other countries where they are legal. So then you can have a disconnect between the organization on what is that overarching policy of how we work, our beneficiary practices, all of these things. So again, it wouldn't make sense for us as an organization, if that is the case, to speak out on maybe something that's breaking in Belarus around gay rights, if we aren't actually credible in it overall. So when you're thinking about your position and your response, this can come from the policy and advocacy teams. It also can come from leadership. Really see how you are positioned and how credible, and whether you're an authority on the issue. Political. So again, how is the shifting political landscape? This kind of goes back to the search and rescue story I mentioned to you at the beginning. When we launched that boat in the between Libya and Italy in the Mediterranean, we did not see how Europe and the EU specifically was going to respond to the refugee crisis of 2015. It was underestimated. And as such, we then really missed the mark in the messaging. We thought that they would see it as a crisis. In fact, they saw it as a real risk. So we didn't see the political landscape coming and therefore missed it. So that should have been part of our landscape mapping. Scenario planning, again, when you're in the middle of a crisis, especially if it's geopolitical or humanitarian. So I know that Scouts deals and responds to many humanitarian crises around the world, whether they are man-made or natural. And then that's a really good time to do scenario planning, figuring out, okay, what's going to happen next? Do we need to get access to more rural communities? Do we need to get in media? Because it's one of the crises that tend to be easily forgotten if it's famine, that kind of thing. So it's really important to figure out what happens next and therefore plan for it. Stakeholder mapping, who are the players we've discussed. Ally and detractors. So this is an important one when you're thinking about sympathetic media and or voices. So if you know that someone is going to support you because they are your ally, they're very bought into Scouts, they're a high influential voice, in the middle of a crisis, it might be a good time to call on them and ask them to use their platform to support you. This could also look like media, right? If you have a sympathetic journalist who's more likely to hear the story, Susanna, in your market, knowing, instead of just saying that didn't happen in our market, to go to this individual and explain to them, this is actually the structure of Scouts. And this is how what our board and governance looks like. This is what happens in Boy Scouts of America or wherever it may be. This is their structure, but this is how we're working together in trying to deal with this. And this is what's going to be happening of that accountability messaging on the other side. So if you have someone who's willing to have that conversation with you, you might be able to shape the narrative in a more beneficial way. On the other side, if you have people like Ian Burrell, who I mentioned earlier, who you know no matter what are not going to be bought in to your arguments and to your messaging, those are your detractors. You need to monitor them because they hold high influence and can sway the position, the conversation, and the credibility of the argument either way. Gap analysis, this is a bit of a jargony term, apologies, but just you've looked at everything, you've done your landscape map. Where are the gaps? And could it be of, we've missed this before, actually we didn't have a very robust response. What are the roadblocks in front of you that would make communicating and actually a response to a crisis really challenging for you? Any questions on landscape mapping?
I have two questions on a different topic.
Yeah, no.
Two questions related to forming crisis management teams. So Marcelo from Brazil is asking about the ideal composition, like how do we choose who really needs to be part of this team, which I know you touched on, but maybe we can go over that a little bit more. And then related to that, Kelvin from Zambia is asking, for those of us in third world countries where resources are scarce and volunteerism is very low, how would such a crisis team be formed and made operational? If you have any tips on that.
Excellent. So Chris, do you want to touch base on kind of the composition?
Sure. For me, it is your core unit needs to be someone that has executive authority on whatever the situation would be, which is, if it's finance related, it needs to be someone that has the check writing authority on the finance side. Communications needs to layer into that as well, and then legal. So that to me forms, that's a good way for me to think about just kind of like the iron triangle, so to speak, of who needs to be a core unit of the team. The subject matter expert on the issue, someone from legal, it's always good to have that involved, that's what we found, and then communications. So those three can really serve as your core unit, and then you can build from there. And I think that will allow you to get your arms around the situation, at least an initial assessment, and then you can move it into a larger group if need be. But if you think about it, I think subject matter expert, legal, comms, that'll give you a good start.
Yeah, agreed. Excellent. And then with the markets that are operating with a lot of volunteers and kind of lower streamlined teams, David, I'd invite you also to jump, you and Farah and anyone from the Global Bureau to jump in maybe on this, but I would actually say that's where the structure really, really benefits you, because you do have this additional resources of really skilled individuals, whether they're in Kuala Lumpur or at the regional office, who would be able to help. And the more kind of, again, landscape mapping, sorry, but the more we share these types of issues amongst each other, the easier it is for them to dip in and out to help you with your capacity.
Yeah, you can put in a service request through WISDOM Services if you're dealing with a crisis, and contact your regional office, I would say, right away in order to help mitigate and move things as quickly as possible. I would do both.
Yeah, because I think it's also, and just sorry, one further point to that is a crisis can be all consuming. And therefore, the kind of everyone's eye gets off the ball of regular programming or your day-to-day activities at Scouts. So the more you can point and pull in assistance from other offices, the more you guys can get back to business as normal. And that it does enable that you don't then prolong a crisis or have a longer term or even a crisis in a different area because you had to move your eye from the ball, if that makes sense. Great. Excellent. So now we're actually going to start talking through the communications response. We've been doing that as we talked about it, but a lot of that has kind of what we've talked about so far has been in the preparation stage of those buckets that Chris walked you through at the beginning. When we started working with Scouts and actually with many organizations, we like to look at what we would think are the key principles that should guide your communications messaging and strategy. One of the first ones we want to talk about is message discipline. So we know very you know, as communicators, this can be hard to hear, but you have to say the same thing consistently and frequently for people to actually hear it. And that often individuals, audiences around the world won't hear the message the first time you say it. We have to, especially in a crisis, really speak consistently and coherently with one message globally. The reason being is that when you have conflicting messages in response to a crisis, it can be really, really difficult to actually build back from that crisis because your audience is confused. They do not understand or see Scouts as one, as kind of the different organizations it is in each country, right? So you all understand your structure, but actually globally into the external audience, you're one big organization. So it's really important that when you're looking at message discipline, either in national offices or from a global response perspective, that there's consistency in the way you message and in what you say. Accountability and transparency. Again, Chris has really touched on this, but within cancel culture, within a moment where impact is so important and you have to own it, right? There needs to be accountability for the actions and really being transparent about what has happened, why it has happened, and what you're going to do about it. So it can be really comfortable to message vaguely when a crisis happens in response to a media request, but you have to be really transparent with all of your messaging within a safe guidelines that would enable you to answer the questions effectively and really know what's going on. This also actually goes back to the list of questions we talked through in the situational analysis. Let's always strive for greatest transparency internally, that will help us to prep and frame externally. Focusing on impact and action. Again, it is really, really common in international organizations and actually most businesses, Chris said, it's super easy to want to talk about your own mission, your business purpose, all of these things up front, but actually increasingly the audience only wants to hear, they want a lot less talk and a lot more action. So we need to be really, really careful that we lead with action and impact. We actually say this, if I'm looking at it from empathetic terms, this is what's happened. This is the impact it has had, and this is what we're going to do about it. We're holding ourselves accountable and we're demonstrating meaningful action. Also, very importantly, it isn't just about saying it. You have to actually back it up with proof points that action has been taken. It's really common in a crisis to keep saying, we will, we will, we will. It has to move from, and quite quickly from we will to we have. So moving from from promise and commitment statements to action. Internal first is the fourth one that we would like to make sure that happens here. The reason being, increasingly, especially when you work in purpose-based organizations, so those who, many of you are volunteering, you're doing it because this matters to you, because Scouts matters to you, right? So therefore, we need to make sure that our internal audiences are treated as a huge and very important stakeholder. Therefore, if something is about to break in the press, you want your internal audiences to hear it from you first. You don't want them to find out about a headline in the LA Times or whatever it may be from reading the newspaper. You want your internal audiences to feel equipped that if their mom were to call and say, why are you still volunteering with Scouts? Didn't you see this horrible story? This is really awful, that you feel equipped to respond to that because it's something that matters to you. So treating your internal audience as a key priority stakeholder also helps to mitigate them ever becoming a risk. Again, with purpose-based organizations, we tend to lean towards action, and we're more likely, unlike in a corporate setting, to speak up, speak out, and demand action from our organizations. So it's really important to make sure that you are managing that stakeholder as well. Chris, did I miss anything? Excellent. So we're going to talk a little bit about messaging here. And one of the things we wanted to touch base on is, again, that idea of one voice and message discipline. Here's an example of that you guys will all be very, very familiar. You have two individuals on the screen that you may know, the Oxfam GB's former CEO, Mark Goldring on one side, and the international CEO, whose name is Winnie. And in 2018, Oxfam, there was huge media headlines globally about the exploitation of beneficiaries in Haiti. And it had happened during the earthquake, which at the time, the Haiti office was run by Oxfam GB. Therefore, in the structure of Oxfam GB led on the crisis messaging. What didn't happen is that they didn't realize there wasn't the lined up internal one voice messaging structure. They looked at it as something that had happened only to Oxfam GB, and therefore they communicated in that way. What then happened is you had the international office actually being asked what had happened, and they had to provide a different statement. As you may know, Mark Goldring did a very poor media and crisis interview where he actually said he didn't understand why everyone was so upset. It's not like they had murdered babies in their cots. To which, of course, the international office had to say, that's not okay. And they took a completely different line. The problem with that was everyone then went and sought sympathy and empathy for the international office, but it started to pin the two against each other. This is really common and can be a real challenge for federated business models or international organizations, but it really highlights the need for for message discipline, pre-planning and landscape mapping, and coming together as one organization in the way that the external public see you. Excellent. So we're going to start and move into shaping the story. So actually looking at your response and your messages. I want to quickly give another example of where a story maybe wasn't shaped in the way that we wanted it to be. So this is unfortunately, in the world that we're in, this is March 2020. If we look at the COVID map now, it's horrific that we all know that this looks great compared to where we are today. But what we want to talk about in this map is actually of the timeline that it took for the World Health Organization to declare it a pandemic and how that story was shaped. So as we know, that it slowly, as COVID became more and more of a prominent issue around the world, governments, the World Health Organization, everyone started telling their story, but they started telling their story in an isolated way. It wasn't until January 30th that the WHO actually declared COVID a pandemic last year, but by that point, you were already seeing huge numbers around the world, and especially out of Asia. There was a real opportunity and a gap between then what happened in January to actually when most of the world shut down at the end of March, to actually shaping the story to help the public move through behavioral comms, to change their behavior, to engage with scientists in the way that we're hoping they will now. A number of strategies in managing a crisis had been missed. Again, it's an unprecedented crisis. We're not at all saying that someone did something poorly in these types of things, but what we're saying is they didn't use the opportunity to build out the messaging strategy and start to communicate with the public in a transparent and accountable way that may have enabled us all to respond to it in a different manner. So then we move in, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
So we're talking about shaping the story, and this is just so you can begin to think about from a comms lens, how do you go about constructing these messages as Kirsten outlined? Part of that is thinking through your messaging and versus the approach. And this has a little bit to do with, again, as Kirsten said, you need to be part of the communications, and the challenge is communicating actually what you're doing. The public wants to see actual measures that are taking place, operational changes. It's not just flowery language. It's just not the perfectly worded statement. All things that are important, how you communicate it stylistically, but really what's undergirds that is more important, which is what are you operationally doing to address these issues? So you really need to press your organization and your teams to really be thinking about these, shaping a story through that lens. When you're engaged with the media, you want to think about, is this particular outlet or this particular journalist, is this someone that is considered an ally? Or is this someone that has more of an adversarial relationship? They do have a duty as journalists, as you're well aware, to try to report a story as accurately as possible. And there are still good journalists that want to do that. So be thinking through, what is their angle? What are they trying to get across as a news organization about this organization or about an issue? It's important to know that. It's important to decide whether you're going to address, is it better to address a certain situation proactively, or is it something that we need to reactively respond to? It all varies, right? And you have to weigh many different variables in deciding that. You can then construct kind of an engagement grid, which is more like at a timeline. And I think you'll have an example of this in some of the materials, which delineates roles and responsibilities, who's communicating what to whom. Going back to what Kirsten said earlier is consistency. That's another key core principle that you've heard us talk about a lot today. If you have too many stakeholders communicating different things, that's problematic, right? It takes repetition over time for a message to get across, to cut. And so in order to do that, you have to be as disciplined as possible in making sure that each of your internal stakeholders, your allies, are all speaking from the same sheet, so to speak, and it's in a consistent manner. One thing that you'll see, and as you see many large organizations, sometimes leadership says something different than maybe a regional representative says, and that causes all sorts of different problems down the line. So consistency, coordination is very important. And then in terms of shaping the story, there's obviously materials development, which we talked about earlier too, making sure that you have talking points, message sheets, Q&As. Sometimes there's a creative element of that as well that can be put together. Video scripts, everything that's necessary, the communications toolbox that's going to help craft that story and tell it from your perspective. It's important to get all that together.
Excellent. Any questions?
Just a warning that we are at about 5-6 minutes left. We can go a few minutes over, but I assume some people will have to leave in the next 5 or 6.
Perfect. Apologies. So we will, okay. So this is, again, as Chris mentioned, this is going to be coming back to you in your toolkit, so we won't go into it too much. But here's a messaging grid that you can use to help you build those messages out. And as we say, that really lead with care and concern and compassion. So that empathy messaging, that look at then at control. So this is, what are you doing about the issue? Your commitments. This is where you can have a commitment statement. So we've led with impact and action. Then we're going to talk about what we're going to do forward looking. And then you can do your return to mission or BAU messaging. Often you'll see, again, we've talked about it before, it's really natural to want to say, to lead with the business message up top. Unfortunately, you have to, let's flip it, right? So it's telling the narrative and flipping it on its head slightly. But again, none of this lands unless you have your proof points. Excellent. So this is actually our last little bit before we were going to open it up for questions anyway further. So there's a huge amount, and David, please feel free to jump in, or anyone from the Bureau, of support that's going to be available for crisis for your teams. So there's going to be a template that will go out to NSOs of really what a crisis plan is. It will have the engagement grid Chris mentioned, also the messaging grid, tools that you can use when you do have a crisis bubbling that you can actually that will help you to build your response plan. Lynn mentioned that you can put in a service request with the Bureau for actually help during a crisis. The regional offices are definitely there to support, and then there will be coordination through the Global Comms Network during a crisis. David, anything you'd like to pick up there?
No, I think you've actually covered it all quite well. To say that this area of crisis communications continues to be an area of focus for us, and I think coordination is key. And where you need support in your local markets, please reach out through regional offices, through WISDOM services. We're here to support you. This network is also a great resource as well. You have lots of peers who are in similar situations and handling these crisis situations. And of course, as we said, this package of crisis communications template materials and resources will be available for you soon.
Excellent. And that's actually it from us. Is there any questions on your side? And we are absolutely happy to stay on, answer them, anything we can do to help.
Yeah, I'll give people a couple minutes to, if you want to raise your hand or add any more questions to the chat, and I can ask a question in the meantime, if that's okay. So I actually, my job before I started working for WISDOM, and I work in social media here, was doing social media for the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Trade in Canada. Actually, I'm Canadian as well. Yeah, so we were in foreign affairs. It was, I mean, Twitter is crisis communications all the time, every day. All we ever did was respond to crises. That is what the Minister of Foreign Affairs does. So there's a plane crash. Were there any Canadians on board? There was a bomb that went off in this country. How many children were involved? Like, it was very, I mean, this is a very extreme example of like dealing with crises on a really everyday basis, but it gave me some really interesting insights in terms of how these things work. And I know, like, I really resonated with what you're saying about the importance of timeliness and deciding on who is involved in those decisions, because if too many people are involved in those decisions, you can't get a response out fast enough, which actually elevates the crisis, because then it becomes a question of, well, why aren't you saying anything about this? And you're not saying anything fast enough. So that's more of a comment than a question. But that's one thing. The other one I wanted to add was about the ability to sort of preempt when something can become a crisis, I think is also an important part of it. Like, for example, even in my role in social, sometimes I see photos and I will flag them to an NSO and say, I think you might want to know about, this photo. I don't know if this is the image of scouting that we really want. Maybe you can get in touch with somebody there. Like, we do have opportunities sometimes. So I think if you ever see something that you think is not, it's a bit questionable for us reputationally, going back to what Susanna said, the impact of what happens in one country will have a wave effect and impact people in other countries as well, and the image of scouting in the world. So to flag those things, I think, is very, very helpful. And then the one that was more of a question was one issue that I really struggled with there was, I felt like once you respond to one thing as a crisis, it kind of meant that you had to respond to everything that was on a similar level as a crisis. And that I found very hard. I mean, of course, this is a very extreme example because we had to respond to so many things there, way more than we have to respond to in scouting. But, when you're looking at what you measure as like the green, amber, and red sort of scale you gave us earlier, I don't know if you have any comments on that. Like, it's hard to give an example from scouting. I can't really think in that sense right now. But basically, I don't know if that question makes sense, if you understand where I'm going with that. It's like, once we decide that this is a crisis, it means that anything that follows this has to be treated the same way, which is really resource intensive. And yeah, do you have any guidance in terms of how we make those decisions?
I'll take one point of that. No, I totally follow your question. I think that's a key component of that heat mapping, stakeholder mapping, landscape planning, is having the insight and the judgment of the team on just what you outlined. If we go in and respond now, what does that look like on an issue? Are we gonna have to do that repetitively across a longer time horizon because of all the issues that you just raised? So I think that is part of, there is no easy answer to that, right? It has to be a collective kind of judgment call, and it requires folks to flag that early. What are the second, third, fourth order effects of us weighing in on this issue? Because you're right, you can create a repetitive long-term problem sometimes by engaging. So I don't think, Kirsten, I don't think there's a tried and true answer. It really is very kind of judgment based on how you do that. But I think it's a very important issue to think through before you make a move.
Yeah. How likely is this to reoccur? Is it something we need to say something on? Yeah.
And I know it can be really, but having that kind of pre-planned forward-looking picture on it, it's awful, but the one that you hear the example that often is, how big was the car crash? So it's kind of like, how many people, where did it happen, the number of, and that's awful. And I hear how grim that example is, but it's thinking through that and then weighing the likelihood of whether it could happen again, and the kind of continued impact of it is really important. I also think, Lynn, just to the first thing you said about the timeliness, is really, really important, especially as you say, when there are a number of stakeholders, that often it can just take too long for a decision to be taken, and therefore it's not relevant anymore, or you've missed the boat, all these things. I would also say it's important to strike this is awful, but striking the right balance, because often also the counter to being too late is actually you can go too early. So it's better to make sure that you've got the right response in place and the right information than actually then going out with something that is kind of an untrue or only a half truth. It's better even just to say, we're looking into it, we'll come back to you, and then to respond with a full, wholesome answer or a robust answer afterwards, than to jump in and provide kind of a play-by-play that may end up then coming back to bite you because it wasn't accurate, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, we do have another question here. Is there a landscape map that was created for WUSM, and will that be shared with NSOs to increase our ability to respond to a crisis in a coordinated way? For example, how do we respond to diversity and inclusion at this time within the context of Scouting's past or history?
It's an excellent question. And I don't know, and David, actually, maybe David, it's more for you.
Yeah, I'm just reading it now. I mean, we can go back and look at the materials that we're creating, and if it makes sense to incorporate that landscape map, and that's helpful, we can certainly do that. I know we give some guidance on doing the stakeholder mapping in particular, so we can certainly include that. And then in terms of the how do we respond to diversity and inclusion at a time within this context of Scouting's past? Yeah, I mean, that may take a whole other webinar. And in fact, I think we're going to have one on diversity and inclusion, if I'm not mistaken, in March. So perhaps that's something we can take forward and unpack in a little more detail there. I don't have a quick answer at this stage.
Excellent, thank you.
We have one more question asking if our guests have any views on what you perceive as the biggest risk to Scouting at the current time.
So Chris, feel free to jump in. I think it ranges, actually, to be honest, I think safe from harm issues are incredibly challenging, and they by nature really they just speak to the public in a way that really polarizes how an organization is seen and felt and understood. So that is one from a risk perspective, but actually I think from the risk or longer term impact perspective is potentially around one voice, and it's about making sure that there is that message consistency, because it would enable you to have a stronger response when there are issues, and therefore being able to deal with historic cases that are going to be really, really challenging for all of you and have a global impact. That kind of feels like a really hard one that needs to be grappled with quite quickly.
And I'll just add on that, just one other thought on that. I think the other macro issue is just, and this is every organization, and particularly you are dealing with young people, is their communications channels are constantly iterating and changing, right? And so you really have to be attuned to how they are communicating on various platforms. And someone mentioned earlier, flagging issues in real time. That's just going to be becoming increasingly difficult, but it's going to be increasingly necessary for you to do as an organization to understand that, because it's not just going to be Scouting's reputational issues are just not going to be, the BBC or the front page of a newspaper. It's what's going on in the social world. That's really what's at play. And as you know, with all of us, with our phones and all the Scouts with phones, that's a medium in and of itself. And all the upside and all the downside that goes with that. So I just think that's really going to be, that's the challenge of the future, the present. And so it's just something to always be thinking about and be cognizant of.
Thank you. I have one more. I guess this will be our last question. Can we consider this pandemic time as a crisis for Scouting? How can we deal with it in terms of communications? Meaning, how can we make society understand that Scouting is still relevant in times that kids cannot be together?
Oh, that's an excellent one. It's incredibly, incredibly relevant. And I think it is something that all businesses are struggling with in so many different ways. Chris, feel free to jump in. I think changing what you're seeing, where we're seeing that it's working is those organizations who are adapting to the current situation. So we know that again, this is just off the cuff thinking, but that also the pandemic is having a huge impact on the mental well-being and the mental health of young people. And one of that is because they are isolated. They can't go to school, they can't see their friends, they can't socialize. And that is something that Scouts really did offer and really helped to advance with children, right? So it's important with young people to maybe provide other safe platforms where they can engage with each other in a safe environment, virtually, whatever that may be. And that can help by repositioning how you respond to the crisis would give Scouts something to say in this moment of how you're adapting, and also then to really, that would allow you to double down on the purpose and the value of Scouting, because you are enabling this community, even if they can't be together online.
And I think just on that too, I think coming out, well, I was going to say coming out of the post-pandemic environment, I just think there's an opportunity for Scouting too. The environment, nature, all of these issues that you have been at the forefront of and what are part of your mission. I just think and you're seeing in some of the trend stories now in stateside, is just kind of people wanting to experience that and what the world has to offer in terms of not so much just what's the word, the city, urban, metropolitan sort of environment. I just think there's a real opportunity there for Scouting and some of the programmatic things that you've done. And obviously it has to be within the context of, health and safety and the pandemic environment, and all of that stuff is obviously an overlay to that. But I do think there's a real opportunity for you to communicate that mission and all the benefits that it brings. I think you'll find there's a lot more receptive audience, and there always has been for Scouting, but I just think there's just going to be an increased interest in that from a lot of sectors.
Yes, great. I'll also share here the link to the Trello board of social media content as well. We have some content there about resources that Scout leaders and NSOs can access for Scouting from home. So I think like putting the emphasis on this is also very helpful in this time, that we can continue Scouting, that a lot of places are still doing Scouting online, and that's really saving a lot of young people, like helping them with their well-being at this time. So we can really put the emphasis on that. I'll share the link again here. I just have a couple more comments to share, and I will let you go after this. So Simon from the UK says, to agree with the speakers, the pandemic has been a good method to share with the public what we're doing. Not one I would have chosen, but it's working for us in the UK. And Kelvin is asking, so in such cases where socializing is not possible for kids in WISM, thinking of creating a stage or a platform from which Scouts can tap into virtually on a daily basis to get or connect to others. Kind of a comment / question. But yes, I think that those platforms, from what I'm seeing, are varying from group to group, but having that space is absolutely necessary. Did you have anything to add on that?
No, I think it sounds like it's also working well for the UK team. So great insights and learning there.
Yeah, one of the resources on that board we have is the UK's The Great Indoors campaign, which was I think really nicely marketed and packaged with lots of activities for indoors. Scouts in Victoria, Australia also did some really good ones. So, I mean, I think that's the nice thing about having this type of network, is we can share those resources with each other. We don't all have to reinvent them. So please take advantage of that and the fact that we have this group. And don't forget to use this group as well as a resource to you. If you have questions, if you want to know what people in other countries are doing to deal with these types of crises that are really global in nature, we can connect in this group. And yes, David says in the comments here, you can always reach out through WISM services or your regional support centers. Please don't hesitate. Want to put the emphasis on that. That said, we are 10 minutes over time. We actually didn't lose participants, so they must be very interested in what you have to say to stay for such a long presentation. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with all of us, Chris and Kristen. It's very, very much appreciated. David or Farah, if you have anything else to say, please unmute yourself. If you wanted to sign out, you're good. Okay. And then the last thing is I put the poll link here. So please do help us decide on what you need or want to learn more about in future sessions after today. And we will follow up in the group with the resources that Kirsten and Chris have mentioned, so that we can share with you, that toolkit and so on. Before that, we'll share the recording of today's session and their presentation deck, and we encourage you to share that with other people who might become part of that core crisis communications team within your NSO. We remain at your disposal for any questions or anything else that you may need. And I will leave it at that. So again, thank you all so much on behalf of everyone in the group today, and hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.